What's up, guys? This is Mr. Eldridge, and today's video we're going to look at the English colonies and specifically the British colonial governments. So, since the reign of Henry VIII and his daughter Elizabeth I in the 16th century, there had been very little in the way of religious toleration in England and its territories. After they had passed the Act of Supremacy, which said that Henry VIII, the head of the British government, was also the head of the church, the English monarch sat as the official head of the Church of England, also known as the Anglican Church. The Act of Uniformity, 1558, and then passed officially in 1559, would regularize prayer, divine worship, and the administration of the sacraments in the Church of England. And so you have the aspect of worship, you have the aspect of church attendance, and the common use of the common book of prayer amongst people under the English crown. Failure to uphold either of these would result in penal penalties, persecution by Anglican officials and members of the clergy, and social discrimination by others for dissension. Therefore, you're going to have a group of people that will call for a change in the church. One of the primary groups to oppose these measures outside of Catholics were a group called the Puritans. They were a dissenting religious group in England and in Wales, and they wanted to simply purify the church. The feeling was that the church had become corrupt. Now, these Puritans were Protestants who held true to the messages of Martin Luther and John Calvin, and vehemently rejected the Anglican Church's stark similarities with Catholic theology and structure. These similarities existed due mostly to the fact that the Anglican Church's formation in the 16th century was predicated more on political power and the desire for Henry VIII's marriage annulment than actual theological disagreements with the Roman Catholic Church. This meant that the Puritans were merely reformers that desired a more purely Protestant church, i.e. the idea that they wanted to purify the church. Those Puritans who opposed the Act of Uniformity and other Anglican policies were persecuted to the point that they felt like they had to leave. Those Puritans who fled religious persecution in England are often referred to as, quote, pilgrims, many of which that settled in religiously tolerant Netherlands or in the English colonies. And so the first English settlement that explicitly sought religious autonomy and an escape from religious persecution in England was the Massachusetts Bay Colony, founded in 1628 and led by a man by the name of John Winthrop. The Massachusetts Bay Colony established a Puritan colony that was meant to function as a religious model for the rest of the world, or as John Winthrop said, a, quote, city upon a hill. This trend of persecution and exodus from England in religious dissidence was indicative of most English colonial settlements during the 17th and 18th century. Now, on the other hand, the Pennsylvania colony, settled in 1681 by William Penn, was created as a safe haven for other religious dissidents known as Quakers. Quakers were radical Puritan pacifists. This meant not only did they not fight back against persecution, but they allegedly only, quote, quaked in the fear of God rather than any person or element of nature, thus the name that we use as a, quote, Quaker. On the other hand, you have the colony of Maryland, established by Lord Baltimore of England in 1632, was created as a safe haven for Catholics until falling under Puritan control in 1689. And so culturally, the colonies really varied based upon their location, i.e. New England was going to be different from the middle colonies, and that was going to be different from the southern colonies, and there are sections within colonies that are going to be different as well. The Massachusetts Bay Colony was settled mostly by Puritan families with male heads in their mid-30s. New England colonies were often very stable in regards to family structure. They were very family-oriented. They were community-oriented rather than, say, in the southern colonies in Virginia. Virginia was single males seeking riches and were far more competitive, violent, and unstable. As time went on, those colonies in the southern colonies, particularly those in the Chesapeake Bay region, they're going to double down on agriculture. They're going to have that agrarian vision, if you will, profiting on the sale of cash crops, most notably in Virginia, of course, that being tobacco. But also, you get into places like South Carolina. You're dealing more with crops like rice. The northern colonies in New England initially practiced agriculture, but they gradually began to focus on fishing and commerce, as there were issues with agriculture not being as productive and lucrative as it was in the South and in those southern colonies. When we talk about the southern colonies, we have to bring up the issue of slavery. We have to discuss the issue because agricultural production required and needed more manual laborers. Many of the early manual labor was done by indentured servants. These, of course, were white Europeans who paid for their journey to the New World through these labor contracts. This practice was difficult to maintain, as many indentured servants simply fled their plantations to claim their own farmland in the New World. Land was cheap. Land was accessible. And so these Europeans had the ability to blend in easier. And oftentimes there were more success. And it was very difficult to find these indentured servants that were leaving. This was the point at which the English colonies are going to introduce, and they began to purchase African slaves, specifically from Western Africa, most of whom were obtained from Portuguese merchants that purchased the slaves from those West African kingdoms. As a cheap labor source, slavery became commonplace in the southern colonies by the late 17th century and continued to grow exponentially. The South became more dependent on slave labor than their middle and northern colonies. This created a socioeconomic rift that would emerge as a source of conflict as we move into the 19th century. First off, let's talk about the Virginia colony in regards to their government. There were many different forms of government in the colonies, but one thing they had most common was that despite their differences, they were successful. One such example of that, of course, being in Virginia. In 1642, Virginia established a colonial representative assembly. This representative assembly was known as the House of Burgesses. It was an elected assembly that had the authority to levy taxes and establish a militia. They, speaking of Virginia, also upheld English common law and established regional judges that would go on, quote, the circuit, if you will, where they would go out into the countryside and they would listen to cases and make decisions, and once the decision was made, that was, quote, the common law of the land. All despite the fact that their administration was a complete departure from traditional British nobility and monarchy. You move now into Carolina. In 1669, the Carolina colony set up a unique form of government unlike any other that had been seen in Western political history. Devised by the radical political theorist and philosopher that we've talked about, John Locke, Carolina established what is often referred to as a limited oligarchy. Of course, an oligarchy is a government run by a small group of individuals. The Carolina model was limited in that the oligarchy itself was confined to the expressed powers of a little c constitution. This oligarchy was headed by a group called the Lord Proprietors, all bound by a constitution, and much like the others, prospered and grew, acting as a near autonomous state. Lastly, let's talk about the colony of Georgia. Georgia had implemented an experimental form of government. Chartered by King George II in 1732, Georgia was set up as a socio-political experiment with a board of trustees, similar to what we would think of today as like a corporate board. And that corporate board, that board of trustee, would be the one that would control the aspects of the government. The goal of the trustees in the colony itself would be to provide a redemptive haven for those seen as, quote, unfit and unproductive in Great Britain. So if the English government in London felt like a person was not worthy of staying in London anymore, they would be banished. They would be sent away. One of those places that they would be sent away would, of course, be the colony of Georgia. Georgia was designed as a home for what was referred to as the deserving poor, the crippled, the criminal, and other groups, as a chance for said peoples to become functional and productive members of society. Almost what we think of today in a rehabilitative state. While its board gradually lost its authority to a representative assembly, it, much like the other colonies, stabilized, grew, and succeeded in administering a stable colony. And due to the success that we see, due to the fact, as we've seen in previous videos, how you have colonies that are able to succeed, you see these governments that are being established, you're seeing a lot of success. You have to understand the notion of salutary neglect. Salutary neglect was a policy by the British Crown. You have an entire ocean between these two entities. You have the British government, London, and you have the colonies. And you have an ocean between the two. The British Crown did not have the time, money, or resources to directly manage and administer these colonies. You have to know, England is creating an empire, if you will, and they can't be everywhere. And so colonies operated much like an autonomous individual state. Colonial governments collected taxes, raised militaries, and dictated commerce, all without the oversight of the British Crown. While these are all considered normal government practices, such autonomy technically required the approval and oversight of the British monarchy. However, the colonies essentially went decades without any real supervision or management by the British government. An example of this would be the collection of navigation acts. The navigation acts are going to put into limitations things that could be traded, bought, or sold in the colonies from other countries like France and Spain. But there was nobody controlling and regulating this. So colonists would buy French molasses. They would buy hats from other European countries, and there was no control, even though explicitly it said under the Navigation Acts that a colonist could not do that. As years went on, the British, as we are going to see in period 3, the British are going to try and control more of the colonies, especially after the French and Indian War. The colonies would almost universally call for independence, or at the very least, a continuation of their near autonomy and a voice in the British government. Thank you so much for paying attention to this video. If you have not hit that subscribe button, please make sure you go ahead and do that. Like this video. Thank you so much, and you have a great day.